The NHL season may be over, but that does not mean the content stopped. The draft, free agency, trades, and a whole lot more to discuss. Hunter, Hodies, and I have you covered on today's edition of Locked On NHL.
You're Locked On NHL, your daily podcast on the National Hockey League. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's edition of Locked On NHL. I'm Nick Zararis, one of the hosts of Locked On Oilers. That is Hunter Hodies, one of the hosts of Locked On Penguins. I want to thank everybody making Locked On NHL their first listen of the day. Locked On NHL, a part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Before we get to today's episode, it is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. So, Hunter, a whole lot to get to today. We're going to wrap up the season, first segment. Second segment, we're going to highlight some free agents we're interested in general. And then last segment, we're going to touch on some trade candidates who may be interesting for various teams across the league. So, when I ask you, what are you going to remember from the 2023-2024 NHL season, what's going to be the first thing that comes to mind?
First thing that comes to mind, I think really just how awesome of a season it was in general. I think this is one of my favorite seasons that I've watched ever since I got into hockey about 20 years ago. There were so many great games on a nightly basis throughout this season, and that continued into the Stanley Cup playoffs. I mean, it's part of the playoffs, some rounds were better than others, but I think this was obviously one of the best Stanley Cup finals that I've ever watched for as long as I've been a fan of this sport. And it's funny, it went from one of the worst to one of the best just because the Panthers were out to that 3-0 lead, might be a sweep, and then Edmonton comes clawing back. They lose a really close game 7 overall, and it was just a great Stanley Cup final overall. But I think just when you come at it full circle, the thing I'll remember most is just how amazing of a season it was in general. So many great games, great Stanley Cup final, easily the two best teams in the league going at it. And I don't know if the league will have a season like this for a little bit. It was just an amazing season overall.
Yeah, it's one of those outlier seasons. We haven't had a Stanley Cup final go to a game 7 since 2019 and before that 2011. So that alone is pretty rare. We had absolute chaos in the regular season in the Eastern Conference where nobody wanted those last two playoff spots until basically the last month of the season where the Islanders and Capitals were able to separate themselves from Detroit, from Buffalo, from Pittsburgh, but very compressed in the middle. That's not necessarily an affirmation of Gary Bettman's proclamation that we have a league riddled with parity. If anything, I think it's a case that all of the mediocre teams beat up on each other as opposed to the great teams and the middle of the pack and the bottom half. I think the thing that's going to stick with me the most, and this isn't groundbreaking news, but there's more than one way to do this. You look at the Oilers, you look at the Panthers, two teams built in very conflicting ways. The Panthers only with 3 guys they drafted in their starting 18 in Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final. A lot of free agent signings, a lot of gambles. And that's really the big takeaway. And I forget if it was Sean McIndoe who wrote this column in The Athletic yesterday. It might have been Pierre LeBrun. I apologize for not remembering who wrote it. But the main thesis was general managers are too careful. General managers would rather hit a single than try and hit a home run. And because of that, they don't trade first-round picks for Sam Reinhart's. It was a big gamble to trade a first-round pick for Sam Reinhart, not knowing what type of production he was going to have or if you were going to be able to extend him long-term. Now, we know the Panthers are not going to be able to keep all their unrestricted free agents. Half of their 6 defensemen are free agents. We just mentioned not Brandon Montour, Sam Reinhart. Also have a few other guys up front like Tarasenko are free agents. They won't be able to keep all of those guys. Doesn't matter. They won their Stanley Cup. They'll keep one of Montour or Reinhart. They will overpay to do so, and everything will be happy. At this point, it doesn't matter anymore. But I think that's something that a lot of general managers around the league would benefit from, is taking a swing when the opportunity is there. We're going to talk about some free agents. We're going to talk about some trade candidates who may have the opportunity to help alter a team's direction and maybe give them a shot in the arm the way the Panthers did. You look at the way the Panthers assembled this roster. This is not how you would draw it up. There is a lot of variance and there is a lot of gambling on upside. That's really the undercurrent of all of these teams. You know, they traded for Brandon Montour. They traded for Sam Bennett. They traded for Sam Reinhart. They traded for Matthew Tkachuk. And Tkachuk, there was a real question of, is he a guy or was he just riding on the best line in hockey, which he was 2 years ago with Johnny Gaudreau and Elias Lindholm? Now, I think we can emphatically say Tkachuk is one of the 5 to 10 best wingers in the entire league, and he's probably a top 10 to 15 player in the entire league when he's healthy. You have to take risks to get those types of players, and there are too many teams that are very comfortable being in that middle. You know, there are a lot of teams excited to be in that middle. You know, Ottawa got Linus Ullmark, and that's great. They still got a whole lot of issues other than just goalie.
Yeah, I mean, with Florida, I know a lot of teams are going to try to copy what they do. But, Nick, I feel like that's so easier said than done. Like, you can go back and look at some of these other Stanley Cup champions and, like, okay, they have a full model that I think you can kind of replicate a little bit. But with the Panthers, I don't know if all these GMs can copy what they do, just because you look at that team, they're not really built through the draft. It's a lot of free agency signings. It's a lot of big trades. And we've all seen how scared GMs are to make big trades at times in this league. I mean, you compare this to something like the NBA, where you see a big move all the time in free agency or trades, or even during the trade deadline. It's like the two leagues could be just polar opposites, honestly. So I think teams are going to have to, you know, if they want to build like Florida, they're going to have to get a little more creative this summer. Do you move more salary to go after someone big in free agency, which we'll get to in just a second? Are you going to swing for a big trade? Because there's a lot of really good players that are involved in trade rumors right now. So again, it's easier said than done. I'm curious to see how that happens this summer as teams try to figure out, okay, Florida, they're a differently built team. How do we kind of replicate that for next season?
And the one thing I want to expand off of that, and you bring this up, I bring this up all the time, just signing guys from teams that won the Stanley Cup does not mean they're going to be able to do what they did on the team that won the Stanley Cup. There are a lot of teams that are very guilty of signing good players without a real understanding of what makes them successful. They just want the name and think because they're good, they will figure it out no matter what. And that's just kind of not how sports work. You can have a team of 18 very talented skaters and a really good starting goalie. If you have 18 guys with the exact same skill sets, you're not going to be a very good team. Too many teams prioritize the resume and the track record as opposed to the fit. And fit is almost as important, if not more important, than talent. We talk about this all the time with quarterbacks in the NFL, where if you get drafted to the wrong spot, no matter how talented you are, you're probably SOL because the environment matters so much. And it's the same thing, not to the same degree in hockey as it does quarterback, because quarterback touches the ball every play. But a hockey player going from one system to another, very different responsibilities. You know, I'm very weary of anybody who's coming from the Carolina Corsi machine as is this guy a product of that system, or is this who they actually are? It's really difficult to kind of differentiate and distill out the results from team versus player when a team has such strong impacts. Like, same thing with Florida. I don't know if you really want to roll the dice on Sam Reinhart or Brandon Montour. You know, I know the running joke is that the Leafs are going to trade Mitch Marner to sign Brandon Montour and give Brandon Montour the GDP of a developing nation to fix their defense. Brandon Montour is one guy. He's a solid player. He's not a number one. If he's a 3, you're in okay shape. He's not a 1. If you slap him next to Morgan Riley, you'll probably have a decent first pair, but that's not going to address the Leafs' overall defensive issues. So with that in mind, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to come back, and then we're going to start tackling some of the free agents that are out there that teams are going to be looking to improve their team, coming up next on Locked On NHL. It's awfully hot out there, Hunter. That means it's summer. That means concerts. That means baseball. And if you want to get out to a game, to a show this summer, you have got to check in with our friends over at Gametime. I got Yankee Red Sox tickets for next Friday through Gametime, the only app I use to buy tickets, with some of the best app features in the business. Things like zone deals, where you save more when you choose a section and let Gametime choose the seats. All-in pricing, where they show you the total up front with no surprise fees at checkouts. Seat views, where you get a panoramic view from your seat in the app before you buy. That's the most important thing to me. I like knowing nothing's in my view of the field. The lowest price guarantee, or Gametime will credit you 110% of the difference. Gametime ticket coverage. Your purchase is covered with the most flexible customer service policy in the ticketing industry. So Take the guesswork out of buying MLB tickets, concert tickets, or any type of tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Want to thank everybody listening to this Thursday edition of Locked On NHL. Free agency officially opens on Monday. We're hearing a lot of different things from a lot of different sources right now. It is one big game of telephone. Until Monday, we're not going to know. So people may say we're hearing things. You might hear things start to leak out Monday morning before the window officially opens. But until then, take everything with a grain of salt because no one really knows anything. So
I feel like
who do you want to talk about first?
I was going to say, I feel like there's a good bit of tampering going on right now. I definitely feel like there's deals that are ready to be announced, but they're not going to be officially announced until 12:01 p.m. on Monday. I think players have already agreed to deals with teams, but they're just keeping it a bit quiet right now. But in terms of free agents for this year, I mean, this class, it's not as good as some other classes that we have, but there are still some pretty solid players. I am curious to see, Nick, where Sam Reinhart goes. 57 goals this past season, 94 points. I don't know if he's going to replicate that on a different team. I think it was the perfect environment for him in Florida. I don't think he's going to score 57 goals on his next team next year if he does move on from the Panthers. I do think the Panthers' hopes of re-signing him, they do have the luxury of having the no income tax for Florida. So if they can maybe get him at a little bit of a discount, that would work for them. But I still think when you look at the open market for him, I feel like he's going to get a whole swath of cash. I think you're probably going to see, I would say 8 to 10, 11 teams in on him overall. He's going to sign a max term contract, but I would just be a little bit wary because I don't think he's going to repeat this year's production with his new team if he does leave Florida. I'm also really curious to see what happens with Steven Stamkos. There's really been no word on whether he's going back to Tampa. I mean, there's been talks that he's in contract talks with the Lightning. And I know we kind of went through this situation, Nick, remember the last time, and it was that whole 2-hour stretch, like a few days before free agency, where you had the Hall for Larson trade, and then Stamkos goes back to Tampa, and then you had, Subban for Weber that day as well. Yep. I think all three of those moves happened in a span of just a couple of hours. I mean, I don't think we're going to get round 2 of that this year, but I am curious to see if Stamkos does go back to Tampa or if he signs a shorter term contract with a different team to try and win another Stanley Cup for his career. But another thing I'm looking forward to seeing, are GMs going to overpay for these quality depth players that are a bit bigger, tougher, but that also, I guess, another thing I am curious about, Nick, are these GMs going to overpay for the depth players in free agency, those bigger, tougher players, those bastards, if you will, that can really, go to the net, piss you off. And it's just someone I compare to, I'll just make a Penguins comparison here, someone like a Michael Bunting, someone who's going to get into your face and just become a fan favorite right away. I think someone like Dakota Joshua is going to do great in free agency. I think someone like Jordan Martinook is also going to do great in free agency. Are teams going to overpay for those types of players? I'm going to be watching that a lot on Monday, just because we've seen that type of situation go up these last few years where GMs love overpaying for bottom 6 forwards. I want to see if it happens here as well.
The thing with the bottom 6 forward is every team is entirely convinced that if you sign them in free agency, somebody who's played third line, if you give them a little more ice time and you put them on their power play, the counting stats are going to come along with that. And that's kind of it's the community meme. Has that ever worked for anybody else? No, but we should try anyway. That's what it is when it comes to these bottom 6 guys. I think about the Canucks signing Jay Beagle after the Capitals won the Stanley Cup. I think about the Rangers trading for Barclay Goodrow after the Lightning had gone back to back. These teams think this guy played third or fourth line. We're going to tick up his minutes a little bit. We're going to give him special teams opportunities, and his counting stats are going to come up, and we're going to look great because we're only paying a guy $4.5 million, and we think we can get 50 or 60 points out of him, which is just, it's frankly not the case. There is a reason these guys have third line skill sets on good teams. you can be a bad team and force guys into bigger roles and give them more counting stats. I mean, that's been a lot of teams' MOs over the last 5 to 10 years, where you can have a really good player on a bad team, put up good counting stats, and no one really bats an eye. The other thing is, you mentioned the concept of overpaying, and you kind of always have to overpay for free agents because they're always going to get, $1.5 million, $2 million more than they would have got from the team they were staying with. And that's kind of by design. The way free agency is set up, you get one real opportunity to cash out, maybe two if you take a short-term deal at 27. But if you take the max deal at 27, that's it. You get 7 or 8 years at 27, and that walks you to the end of your career. If you're an all-time great, you're a Marty St. Louis, a Steven Stamkos, a Patrick Kane, you can hang around on those over 35 deals, like the Bruins did with Bergeron and Krejci 2 years ago. But unless you're one of the all-time greats, that's your one opportunity to cash out. So I don't begrudge you for going out there to get as much as you can. Some players I wanted to highlight and talk about. You had mentioned Sam Reinhart. Marcia Show is in the mix. Steven Stamkos is in the mix. Jake Gensel, of course, is in the mix. Tarasenko, Tyler Toffoli, Teuvo Teravainen, Anthony Mantha, Patrick Kane, Jake DeBrusk, Warren Fogle, Anthony Duclair, Elias Lindholm, Adam Henrique, Max Domi. On the back end, Brady Shea, Brett Pesce, Oliver Ekman-Larsson, Brandon Montour, Eric Gustafson, Sean Walker, Tyler Myers, Chris Tanev, Nikita Zadorov, Mike Riley, Ian Cole, Kevin Shattenkirk. There are a lot of guys out there that are going to be able to fill useful roles on your team. But to Hunter's point, a lot of those guys are not going to be able to come in and play on your first line or your first pair and make a huge difference. If the Leafs say we're going to trade Mitch Marner to free up cap space to bring in Brandon Montour, and you play him separate from Morgan Riley and say we're going to have two balanced pairs, I think you're going to be in a lot better shape than if you throw a bag at him and say we're going to load up for one really good pair and figure out the rest, because that's kind of been the Leafs' issue for most of the last few years, is they have one good pair and the other two pairs are held together with glue and duct tape.
No, I agree with you. And the thing about Marner is I just don't really know what that situation is going to entail here, Yeah, and I think the thing is with Marner, I really don't know how that situation is going to end. I can really see it going both ways, to be honest, but I will say the Leafs have to tread carefully here. I know Marner at times has not played that well in the playoffs, but he is still one of their 3 to 4 best players. If you're going to move him, you better be getting quite a solid return overall. I know he only has a year left on his contract, but if you're moving him, you better be dead certain that you have a plan to at least try and replace him in your lineup. I know, we were talking about them going out there and signing Montour. Yeah, that's great. You would have two pretty sound defensemen, but then you also create another hole. How are you replacing Mitch Marner in the scoring that he does in the regular season? And just his play in the playoffs. It's been good at times. It hasn't been good enough, but still, it's a really tricky question that the Maple Leafs are going to have to answer at some point. A couple other guys on here overall for free agency. I'm also really curious about someone like Jake DeBrusk. I do think he's going to finally leave Boston here. I think he's going to sign a short-term contract with a contender. I honestly, though, would not be surprised if the Penguins were to try and go after him. I think there were a couple reports linking them to him during that weird rumored 3-team deal involving Jake Gensel. So I could see the Penguins maybe being in on him, but I'm not sure they're going to sign him. I'm also curious about someone, Nick, like Max Domi. He was more of a playmaker this past season for the Maple Leafs. Is he going to get more term on his next contract? What about someone like Tyler Bertuzzi? I think he could also get a little bit more term on his contract. So yeah, this free agency class, it's a lot of depth players that can play, I think maybe in a pinch on your second line, but mostly on your third line. I don't think most of these guys are going to be able to play on your first line, outside of someone like Stamkos, Reinhart.
Marchessault.
Yeah, Marchessault, Teravainen.
Those four guys are clearly the top of this class. Those four guys. And you could throw Montour in there. And if we're talking defense, you throw Pesce in there. I think Pesce can be a first pair defenseman if you have a good partner for him. But one last thing I wanted to get in there. I got to make the Moneyball joke about recreating Mitch Marner in the aggregate. That's the thing. You trade away like a player of Mitch Marner's caliber, you're going to have a really hard time recreating his production, even if you replace him with four guys. $11.5 million that Marner's getting paid, it's nothing to sneeze at. You can definitely get 2 or 3 players for that amount of money. you're probably not replacing Marner's 90-ish points and Selke caliber defense. You're just not going to do that. So Hunter and I are going to take one more quick break. We're going to talk about trade candidates, including Mitch Marner, coming up. Thank you to everybody listening to this edition of Locked On NHL. It is getting silly out there because there's going to be a lot of money in the system coming in because the salary cap's going up $5 million. We saw Ryan Suter get bought out this morning. There's a lot of players who are waiting for that phone call as to whether or not they're going to be bought out. Jack Campbell of the Oilers comes to mind. There are a lot of players around the league. John Gabriel Pageau of the Islanders, who's also a candidate for being bought out as well.
Jeff Skinner of the Sabres.
Jeff Skinner was bought out as well. There are a lot of players out there who are going to be moving in the next handful of days. With the draft coming up and with free agency opening next Monday, teams are going to be trying to get liquid. They're going to be trying to free up cap space so that way when Monday rolls around, the deal that Hunter has alluded to that's already been agreed to can be officially signed. That's the thing. Teams need to create cap space to be able to make the moves they want to on Monday. We know there are a handful of moves that may or may not happen. We've heard Marty Necas' name linked to the Sabres as somebody who could be moved ahead of the draft on Friday. I don't hate that. I think that's a good fit. Buffalo needs another top six forward. And I've always been a proponent of Necas' game. But there are a lot of talented players out there who may or may not be available for trade. Trevor Zegras' name is out there. Guys like Jacob Chikrin's name is out there. Travis Konechny, Alex Tuch, Pavel Buchnevich, Andrew Mangiapane. There are a lot of candidates out there for a change of scenery who, with a little more ice time, might be able to make something happen for you, or guys who just don't fit what they're trying to do. I think Trevor Zegras is going to end up getting moved from the Ducks, not necessarily because he's untalented. I just don't think he fits what Pat Verbeek wants in a hockey player, and that's going to be to the advantage of someone willing to take a chance on him.
I agree with you. I think he can be a better fit on a different team. I just think he's being kind of misused in Anaheim. And
he's being pigeonholed. Yeah,
I agree. I don't think he's unlocked his full potential yet. He's someone who I could also see the Penguins maybe being in on, just because I know they're looking toward the future a little bit right now anyway. I think there's a lot of untapped potential for someone like Trevor Zegras. Also, someone like Nikolai Ehlers. What's going to happen there in Winnipeg? I think they have some decisions to make this summer. You discussed Marty Necas. I am higher on Necas than some other people. I think he's also someone who has a lot of untapped potential. He's been fairly solid throughout his time in Carolina, but I think he has the potential to reach 30 to 35 goals on a new team. I know Carolina runs a system that, obviously they don't call them the Carolina Corsies for no reason, but I do think in an even more offensive-based system, he could really thrive. I think anyone who gets Necas is getting a real good player there. I'm also curious about someone like John Gibson from the Ducks as well, Nick. He's been in trade rumors, it feels like, for the last 2 to 3 years now. Is anyone going to take a chance on him, and especially that contract, and try and turn him around? He's been one of the worst goalies in the league these last couple of years. I do think part of that is playing on a god-awful Ducks team. I think he's kind of been run to the ground a little bit. So does a fresh start for him kind of rejuvenate him overall? I know the Red Wings have been linked to him a little bit. I think they've been linked to quite a few goalies this offseason. It's obvious that they need another one. Tristan Jarry, I know, has been thrown around there after the Penguins re-signed Alex Nedeljkovic. Does he get moved as well? So this is going to be hopefully a really active next few days as teams start moving around some money. I mean, you saw Vancouver's trade last night, moving the rights to Lafferty and then Mikheyev to Chicago, opening up cap space. It's obvious to me that they're trying to make a run at Jake Gensel. I mean, Jim Rutherford, let's just say it, he loves his guys. So they're opening up some cap space there. And then, again, we've already discussed a few other players, Buchnevich, obviously. We've already discussed Pageau a little bit. Someone like Riley Smith as well from the Penguins. I could see him getting a fresh start on a Western Conference team. Brandon Saad potentially. Maybe I know Philip Gustafson has been out there with the Minnesota Wild. But I was going to bring up Marner, but we already had that discussion, so we don't really need to bring that up anymore. But I'm just
Rutger McGrody we didn't bring up. Ville Heinola we didn't bring up. Jacob Trouba we didn't bring up. There are a lot of names out there in the wind right now.
Rutger McGrody, that whoever gets him is going to get one hell of a player. He's ready to play this year. He can play in your middle six. He can potentially play in your top six if needed. I know Winnipeg's going to be looking for a pretty good package back, but whoever gets him is getting one heck of a player. I wouldn't be surprised if that does happen before the draft this upcoming weekend. At least that's what the rumors have been. But I really do think here we're going to get a fairly active summer. At least that's my hope overall. But it feels like the bigger moves might be via trade compared to free agency.
Yeah, I mean, you think about the candidates who are there for free agency versus who are there for trade. We haven't mentioned Draisaitl, who I don't think is going to be traded because I think they're going to iron out that contract as soon as they figure out who's going to be negotiating it, because we saw this morning Ken Holland told the team he's not coming back to be the general manager. Whether that's Jeff Jackson, who's the president of hockey operations, used to be Connor McDavid's agent, whether he's going to be the general manager for the interim period, whether they're going to promote someone internally or whether they're going to go outside the organization. I think Draisaitl gets taken care of and relatively quickly. The Oilers do have a lot of unrestricted free agents to take care of. Warren Fogle, Corey Perry. They have pretty much their entire bottom six from this playoff run is unrestricted free agents. They've got a couple of restricted free agents in Dylan Holloway and Philip Broberg to take care of as well. So they got some action to take care of, but we're going to see a lot of movement. Carolina has a lot of free agents. Florida has a lot of free agents. The Oilers, I just mentioned. And those were 3 of the 5-6 best teams all year. There's an opportunity here for teams that were not in the mix this year to really improve. We're all waiting to see if the Islanders are going to find a way to create some cap space. We know their entire fourth line, other than Cizikas, are all free agents. They can create more cap space by moving Pajot or maybe moving Ryan Pulock and then create opportunity to improve their team. We know the Devils have been linked to a handful of guys, including Brett Pesce, as a free agent to improve their defense, which was really holding them back last year after they've already traded for Jacob Markstrom. There is opportunity out there. I say this every year at the end of June, early July. You can't win the Stanley Cup when free agency opens. You damn sure can lose it. You look at some of the contracts that teams have been stuck with. You look at Darcy Kemper's contract, which thankfully isn't as long as the Dubois one they got in exchange for that. You think about James Neal. You think about Milan Lucic. You think about Ryan Reeves, all of the Jay Beagle, all of these Tyler Myers, all of these contracts that have been almost instantly regretted a year into them, 2 years into them. And that's just the way free agency works, because you have to give max term and you have to give as much money as you possibly can, because someone is always going to be willing to drive up the price, even if they're not in on the player. The Rangers have been famous for this, where they've been on the phone with the agent and they keep milking the Rangers for another $500,000 to go back to the team they actually want to sign with, to go, well, the Rangers just upped their offer. Can you come up to this? And they go back and forth doing that for the better part of an entire day. And then every now and then the Rangers get somebody they don't expect to get because they lost the game of chicken, essentially. So with all that in mind, you have a lot of information to digest. You have a lot to keep in mind over the next few days as we go through the draft, we go through free agency. There will be buyouts. There will be trades. So make sure you are subscribed to Locked On NHL, where they've got your team covered every single day. And we will be back next week. Make sure you are subscribed wherever you get to Locked On NHL, wherever you get your podcast. If you're on Apple or Spotify, take a second. Please leave the show a 5-star review. If you're watching over on YouTube, hi, hello. These are our faces. Hit the subscribe button, hit the alarm bell so you get a notification whenever new content goes live. Let us know in the comments, what players are you most excited to see in a change of scenery? What fit do you think works the best? Let us know. We'll read some of the best ones next week. Until then, Hunter and I will see you guys.